but just like to welcome everybody along. This is the second in our series of Regenerative Unravelled, and just really appreciate you all making the time. It's a real privilege for us to have you along. And some people from last week have come back again, and some new faces. So welcome to you all. I understand things can be pretty difficult. I hope you're all keeping pretty well and coping with what can be a difficult situation around the world. Mostly New Zealand audience, but we've got some coming in from other parts of the world as well. So once more, welcome. And also I'd like to welcome Trey, our co-host. Trey is CEO of nRhythm, our partner organization in the US. Trey does a lot of work in this space. He's a thought leader in regenerative design, works across the world and over about 35 countries, helping organizations and communities on their regenerative journey. So it's always great to have you on board, Trey. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Hugh.
Just a couple of comments on COVID-19. I think from my perspective, it's actually highlighted a number of things, and I guess the real take home for me is that we've gone into this massive kind of disruption. It's really created a reset for us. But what I've been really surprised at is how quickly man and nature have been able to adapt to these changes and what we're seeing coming out the other end. In fact, it just really shows you that the potential that exists in nature, if we actually create the conditions that we'll actually see potential being realized a lot more quickly than we actually would have predicted. But not only that, it's also probably the potential is greater than we would have predicted. So it's a really good example of what regenerative can be all about. And it just shows that we do create conditions, we can get healthy outcomes. And we're at a tipping point and we've got decisions to make. And we can either use this as an opportunity to go forward with different outcomes, or we can just revert to where we were in a situation where we're obviously taking more from the world than it was able to provide. So it becomes our choice. So hopefully through a greater understanding of regenerative, we can design a better future. Trey, have you got any comments that you'd make on that?
I mean, other than just continued agreement, I think the opportunity for all of us is to reframe the conversation. A lot of it is trying to compete or replace something with something else. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to cooperate and create the conditions for something to emerge that is far better than what we are currently experiencing. And to be honest, this is not about us. It shouldn't be about us. It's about future generations. And I'm thinking about my kids, grandkids, when we're talking about this, not thinking about even my two sons. And so I think I just encourage all of us to really think bigger than ourselves as a part of this. And it took a long time for us to get to a point where this is how our society is designed and organized. And we've got to nurture some different conditions to create different outcomes. And so that means we've got to do some work, and I'm excited about doing it, but it means it's for future generations, and we should be investing in that.
Yeah, it's great. Thanks, Trey. And I think just a little bit more on that. I think we're going to be put under pressure to make decisions, sometimes short-sighted decisions that might be able to provide some kind of quick results. That's not really the space that we want to be going down. I think we've got to be thinking a lot more carefully about how we use our choices to deliver a long-term outcome. So we appreciate those comments. Thanks, Trey. The purpose of what we've set out to do with this Regenerative Unravelled is to try and put some context and understanding around what regenerative is. There's still a lot of confusion, I think, in this space. There's people who try and use the words regenerative for marketing advantage, and that just leads to even more to the confusion. Where have I got to? And the thing about regenerative is it's got real meaning, and we've got to hang on to that real meaning, and we've actually got to start to try and understand it better and look at how we can apply the concepts of that to our own lives and deliver on better outcomes for our own lives and for the business and organisations that we work for. So hopefully in this series of we're putting on, we're going to help you understand the principles of regenerative, how they can be applied to what we're doing, and bring them back into everybody's scope, if you like, so that you can actually feel there's some application there. So, just to recap a little bit, looking back at what we did last week, we talked about how this mechanistic paradigm or the way we think about things as machines has pervaded our lives and everything, and our decision making, and how we treat our organisations, other people, how we treat even within our farms. And the thing about when we do that is we pull things apart, and we take what we call a reductionist point of view. We think about things in parts rather than in wholes. And that has serious unintended consequences. When we look at treating things like machines and managing for production at all costs, so we want to extract everything we can get from what it is we're working with, without really consideration to the health of that system or what we are working with. For example, if a cog breaks, we throw it away and we replace it, and we start treating people like that, and that comes at a tremendous cost. And we can see that happening all around us. If we look at the environment, we know that the environment is badly eroded. Tremendous cost, global cost, degradation to soils, degradation to grasslands, issues around farming, issues around social health. We can see from a population index point of view that extinctions, etc., are actually higher than they've ever been. When we look at social issues and workforce issues, something that trade talks about a lot is the level of non-engagement or unengaged people in the workforce. It comes at tremendous cost. Even in New Zealand, we're looking at estimated costs of about 7.5 billion in lost productivity a year. And when we look at equity or distribution of wealth, we see this unequal distribution of equity, and we see people's position having a great impact on those outcomes, but particularly to disadvantage certain positions of society. Even in our food, when we start looking at our food and where our food comes from, it doesn't have our nutritional content anymore. We can start linking what's happening to our food to disease situations. And Zach Bush has done some great work on this and in terms of the rise of disease. And one that really hits home to me is that the basis of, in 1975, 1 in 5,000 children had autism. By 2010 it was 1 in 10, and by 2035 it's expected to be 1 in 3. So there's some tremendous unintended consequences that are coming out of the way we're managing things now. And we talk about how we approach problems and how we define problems. And we've tried to explain a whole lot of things using this, what we call linear extractionist kind of thinking. But Albert Einstein's really called that out quite well. And when he looks about, when we read that, when a number of factors coming into play in a phenomenological complex is too large, scientific method in most cases fails. One need only to think of the weather, in which case a prediction, even for a few days ahead, is impossible. So when we start to get a whole lot of things acting together the way we do in living systems, we can't deal with them in the way we have done. And we talked a little bit about these problems last week as well. We can look at simple or complicated problems. These things are what we call kind of linear problems. And when we start off with a known list of ingredients, we put them together according to some form of prescription, and we deliver some kind of predictable outcome. But in living systems, it doesn't work that way. We don't start with a blueprint. We don't start with a list of ingredients or a recipe necessarily that works. It's like having two kids and treating them the same way. They're still going to come out differently. So we're dealing with complex problems, and we've got to deal with and manage those differently. So when we start dealing with complex problems, life actually replaces the machine. So we need to be moving our paradigm from a mechanistic paradigm to a living systems paradigm. And that's what I want to talk about a bit more today. So Trey, maybe we can dig a bit more into this whole concept of what is life. I'll stop sharing my screen and leave it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank
if
you.
I can.
I think you can.
Yeah. Well, I hope I can.
Yeah, you just hit the stop, probably at the top stop share.
Stop share. There we go.
Perfect. Great. Well, thanks everyone. Glad to be here again as a part of this Regeneration Unraveled, and I think the exciting thing that Hugh is kind of positioned for our conversation today is us digging deeper into the alternative. And when you think about our current context in terms of the outcomes that we are seeing, it should beg the question, you know, what happens if we change the design? And that's really part of this. Is if we're thinking about how this is being influenced, we're also then looking at considerations that would allow us to impact the outcomes in a way that truly are regenerative, so they can regenerate itself over and over again, and sustainable, because we want to regenerate. We want to sustain something that's regenerative. We don't want to sustain something that's degenerative, right? Which is the current system. So it's been some interesting conversations to talk through. So how do we make that transition or shift? So with that, I'm just going to share my screen, and we're going to just talk about the alternative of life as a metaphor, right, versus that machine. And some of you may have heard some of this before, but when we think about life as something that we would be leaning into and honing insights from, that's very different than our industrialized design. But there's some things that we have to work through when we think about life as a metaphor. One is that we're not talking about a tuna macata. I mean, it's not the idea that everything is a circle. It's really not a circle. It's actually a cycle, right? And there are a lot of cycles happening in, you know, a predator-prey cycle, which we see. But we see that there's a symbiotic relationship. There is a mutualism. There is a interrelatedness that exists. And because of that, in the living system, it informs a very, very different approach. And so when you think about what's just happened with COVID, and when you think about what's just happened in the world that we live in, and how there are real no national boundaries, there really isn't anything to stop life from happening across those. So the more we try to control it, the more we realize it's not controllable. And so it works on a completely different paradigm. It works on a completely different way of the world. And so with that, we just want to talk through, so what is that and how do we understand it? So there's some really interesting research that was done in the late 20th, early 21st century around kind of a systems view of life. And that systems view of life was really trying to take a holistic approach. And it's called the Santiago School. And they really did some amazing research. And actually, it was one of the very first holistic approaches to how to look at biology. And so they took time to look at the simplest form of life, which is bacteria, and they mapped both the chemical, material, energetic pathways of a bacteria. And what they realized when they mapped everything is everything that was needed to maintain pathways generated by the cell all exist within the cell wall. And they also recognized that the defining aspect of life, two key things, its ability to self-maintain and self-regenerate. So then they coined this beautiful term, autopoiesis, which means self-poetry or self-making. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, that is what separates us from machines, right? There is no self-maintenance and regeneration in a machine. or in an industrialized design. It actually needs external inputs substantially to allow it to maintain itself. But in a living system, it is self-maintaining. It is self-regenerative. And that in and of itself is poetry. So with that, there's a couple of insights that they began to discover. One in particular is this, that life is an organized system capable of maintaining itself within a boundary of its own making. So now when you think about that, you think of how powerful that is. That is us. That is, the natural system. It's an organized system capable of maintaining itself within a boundary of its own making. That sounds like a system I'd rather be designing around versus one that needs external inputs to maintain itself. So this is where we connect living with regenerative and regenerative with living. It actually is synonymous. Every living system is regenerative. And so what can we do to continue to cooperate as a part of that living system? So within this system, we began to ask the simple question. So where is life? And the Santiago School said some really interesting things. One is that self-regenerative ability wasn't located in any one place. Well, surprise, surprise, right? No command and control. It's not like there's a central decision-making part of the cell that says, now this is what you do, and this is what you do, and this is what the other person does. No, all of it was within the cell. Everything was self-regenerative. There wasn't command and control. The other thing they began to understand is that life was dependent upon the interconnected and interrelated relationships of all the different aspects of the cell. So you couldn't have life without connection. Let me repeat that. You could not have life without connection. What does that mean about how we organize ourselves socially, organizationally? And then the next was, to me, is one of the most powerful insights of the research, that life itself was an emergent property of all the connections and relationships within the cell. So life didn't just happen. Life emerged as a part of all those interconnected relationships. So what does that say? So if we have organizations or other aspects of social living systems that are disconnected, life doesn't exist. But when there is connection, when there is deep symbiosis and mutualism and interrelatedness, life is an emergent property. And then last is all of the aspects of the cell was in essence autopoietic. There was the ability for it to self-regenerate and self-maintain. So that is what we would call life. And so go ahead.
Sorry, Trey. So we have that understanding of what life is, and so what do we think about as death? What's the other side of that coin? You've emphasized this interconnectedness, and so how do we think about that in this context?
Sure. So that's what's so powerful about this. And just think about the human body, right? So the human body works because all of the interrelatedness within the body. But when you disconnect or pull apart certain aspects of it, it no longer can begin to work as a whole. It actually needs external inputs. Like for instance, we can take the heart and it can survive outside of the body, but it would need external inputs to allow it to survive, just like other organs in our system. But for it to self-regenerate and self-maintain, it needs to be in relationship. It needs to be connected. So when we define what is death, it's inability to self-regenerate. And in addition to its inability to self-regenerate, its inability to have those interconnected relationships. So now what does that practically look like? Well, it looks like this, right? One side is life, the other side is death. Now, I want you to take the application further. When you think about the human body this way, what about the natural environment? many of you I know, because of Hugh's relationships and what's happening with in food and agriculture and in this regenerative space and the environment, we think about the natural environment. So what is life? Soils and microbes and earthworms and bacteria and insects and fungi, all working in concert with one another, in cooperation. But when we're not in cooperation with one another, it's death. Now, you know, without going too much into it on the side, think about industrialized agriculture. Industrialized agriculture doesn't need all of this. It just needs inputs to be able to allow you to produce more, right? And to be more efficient. They found ways to produce more at the expense of the life of the soil. And so death really does show up in the natural environment when those interconnected relationships are severed. Now, it doesn't stop there. It's not the natural environment. It's, what about businesses and organizations? You know, when people are working in concert with one another and when people are not. You know, just think about the teams that you've been a part of where silos exist, where one part of the organization is not talking to the other part of the organization. Well, how about an even more touchy subject? How about community or government, right? Where NGOs are not talking to local government, national governments making decisions in conflict with certain districts in New Zealand, or policy is made in a vacuum and is completely irrelevant to farmers and what's happening on their land. But when it's working in concert with one another, that's where life happens. That's where regeneration happens. That's where life happens. But it can't happen in disconnection. So, Hugh, that's death.
So just thinking back to going through some of the work that came out of the Santiago School, and basically defining some of those characteristics of life. How do we then start to think about that in applying those to, you know, a redesign, if you like, around some of our systems and processes? What are the principles that we need to think about and embrace to pull that into our redesign?
Sure. So right before we go into that, it's a great question. Right before we go into that, I want to give a context of why we need to redesign in contrast to one another. So just show a little bit of contrast. So when we think about this machine or industrialized design, it really thrives on a couple of things that's in conflict with the living system. And the one thing in particular is it engineers this idea of best practices, right? We know that the reason why we can replicate a machine design is because we've done it over and over and over again. And when if it's worked once, it's going to work 10 times, it's going to work 20 times. And all you do is continue to improve that design, right? So you take best practices and you apply it over and over and over again, right? And those best practices turn into and reinforce this idea of prescriptions, right? And unfortunately, when you apply that kind of approach to a living system, we've actually got a real challenge because it doesn't behave that way. Right? It's not a machine. So you can engineer best practices because every context is different. And prescriptions actually degrade the health of the system because it is different. And so instead of degenerating the health of a system, what we want to do is regenerate it. So we think the living systems, to Hugh's point, is all about a principle-based approach. So instead of using best practices, we're shifting from best practices to principles because principles have application in many contexts, right? And then using those principles, we design flexible frameworks. And those frameworks are to help you and the systems that you're part of make decisions that allow you to regenerate the health of the system. It doesn't work to just replicate what somebody has done someplace else. We actually need to scrap that and begin to nurture a completely different environment. Now, to be able to do that, we need to understand a couple of things. That machine paradigm actually requires more energy, just like we talked about. So there's not a single machine that can self-regenerate or self-maintain, which means it needs to extract from the natural environment to maintain its ongoing effectiveness and productivity, right? So to run a machine, to run a vehicle, to run any type of mechanistic system, you need energy. And that energy is coming from a living environment. Oil, gas, you choose it. That's exactly what we need to run a machine. The second thing is in a regenerative system, it actually is less energy because it's self-maintaining. You don't need all that. So what we spend time on is the shifting perspectives and operations from that machine paradigm to the regenerative one, right? To the living systems paradigm. So when we think about that, that gives you the context to why what Hugh said is, you know, we should be really talking about principles as a part of this process. And what principles should we be talking about? There are 6 principles that we really embrace, and they have all come out of this living systems approach and really understanding living systems. And so first is holism. We recognize in living systems there are no parts, and that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. There's magic that truly happens when things are in relationship and in connection. And you can't predict it. So why don't we embrace that and recognize that that exists in a living system and begin to design around that. So we use the application or the example of your supply chain. It's not really a chain, it's a web. And products are dependent upon the health of the entire system, not just, you know, suppliers or producers. So what does it look like for us to recognize that everything is interrelated and we should be designing around that? And then mutualism, understanding the inherent value and dependence on other. There will always be different types of relationships that exist in any system. But what we want to is to design to what is mutualistic and beneficial within that system, which is, I believe, the greatest opportunity that we have as a culture and a society. And that we should not be designing at the expense of the system or the partners within the system. So we want to minimize a plus minus outcome where I get to benefit, but it's at your expense, or you get to benefit, but it's at my expense. How do we create a benefit for both as we move forward? And then uniqueness. You know, when you look at a living system, man, so much exists that is unique. And how do we design around the uniqueness that exists? And when you think about society and social, every person is different. Every person, there should be the ability for us to design in a way that brings out that person's unique genius, originality, their uniqueness, versus what's the opposite of a genius or uniqueness? Commodity. And I'm just telling you guys, for me, it's time for us to just give that up. You know, we need to truly give that up. There's been enough enslavement in the world. Let's kind of throw that aside and recognize it's time for us to empower and create conditions for people to thrive, which means they are unique, they have something to contribute, and we need to design around that as a part of our current system. And then the last 3 is evolutionary, which would probably make sense to a lot of you. We've got to adapt. We've got to be relevant to what's going on. And what I think is our ability to be relevant and change and embrace the dynamic balance that exists in all these changing conditions. That means we've got to be aware and sensitive to what's going on so that we can make those kinds of changes. We also need to recognize, just like we talked about when we were identifying what was regenerative, that there was no command and control. You know, a living system is beautifully designed in a decentralized and distributed way. It is absolutely crazy for us to believe that one person should be able to, or a team should be able to make all the decisions for the whole. It's just not true. And yes, that's how we've done things, but there are so many examples of where that does not serve us. Something happens to those few people and the whole thing falls and fails. So what do you do to design differently? And then last but not least is to recognize this entire design is all around the development of the system, which allows for the growth, the health and the growth of its members. If that's an organization or it's an environment or it's a community, why in the world would we create a system where it's at the expense of those members, right? It needs to be at their best benefit. How do we grow together, enhance this together as a part of that design? So that's really the principles that Hugh is talking about, and what we really embrace as a part of this design, and one that we think set the conditions for us to create regeneration in all living systems.
That's great. Thanks, Trey. It's pretty powerful stuff. I guess one of the big challenges that we face when we start thinking about this, and whether it's within our farming situations or whether it's in our organizations and our businesses, is that what do we have to start changing? Are we going to start to move from where we are now in this mechanistic paradigm, and are we going to start to try and become a regenerative organization, or put regenerative principles in around our organizations, communities, or farms, or even our own lives? What are some of the things that we need to start thinking about changing? How would we look at that?
It's great. I think there's a few different things that I think we would need to begin to addressing. And so as I was showing the triangle slide, the thing that we really spend a lot of time supporting organizations or movements or collaborations is the shifts. So now think about what shifts need to happen to allow for this kind of environment to emerge. So even when we go back to these principles, what would be the opposite of holism? So we're shifting from, say, parts as a mindset, where we are trying to tweak and change and lever like a machine does, to holism, which is all about interrelatedness and nurturing, right? So that's a big shift. So we want to really begin to identify what has to shift, and those shifts are where we would focus our energy, is beginning to create the conditions within an environment to embrace everyone, to embrace what shifts look like individually, what shifts look like on teams, what shifts look like in large organizations or environments or communities. Those are the things we look at. So when we think about this, think about it in these couple of ways. So when we think about life's principles of holism, like we were just talking about, the shift is moving from this reductionist approach. And reductionism, it really is appropriate in some instances, right? We really want to understand the minute points of certain things, but it doesn't necessarily always translate to the whole, right? And just a beautiful example of this is just take hydrogen and oxygen. Do you think adding hydrogen and oxygen together, has anybody figured out how if you just put those two things together, that we would end up with water? No, we wouldn't. Nobody how that's happened, right? But there's something emergent about life that happens when those two elements come together. And so reducing things to its simplest parts don't necessarily mean that we are actually going to gain greater understanding on how to begin to design with life in mind, because that actually results in silos. And those silos get us in trouble, as we all know, right? Because silos result in us dividing things up. Now, when you think of mutualism, also think about what's that mechanistic alternative, that's what we're shifting from. And we're seeing this in all kinds of different places in our organizations, in our lives, in our environment. But we're really shifting from this individualistic attitude. It's as long as I'm taken care of, it doesn't matter what happens. But it does, because it's all, go back to the first principle, it's all interrelated, right? Can't silo that off and act as if you're going to get protected. COVID is a perfect example right now. It shows us just because you try to silo it off doesn't mean it stops. It's living. It finds a way to adapt. It finds a way to adjust. And so what does it look like for us to move to something that allows for us to recognize that we move from this selectiveness to this mutualistic design? And that uniqueness, as we've already talked about, where really the shift is happening from a commodity. It's coming from this idea of being replaceable, and that we're parts. You know, I said in one of my recent articles that I wrote that we really need to recognize, we need to realize that when we take soil and reduce it to dirt, right? When we take people and reduce it to parts, and when we take societies and reduce them to machines, all we're doing is killing the life in all our systems. And that's what happens when we don't recognize the uniqueness in everything that's around us, versus it's just a commodity. It's just a resource to be used up. No, it's not a resource to be used up. It is a resource that can regenerate, which means we've got to design differently. Evolutionary, we talk about the opposite of that is moving from a static or sacred or perfection as the driver, right? And recognizing that, you know, things like best practices only put us in positions of being no longer thinkers and designers, but just adopting it because somebody else figured it out. No, we need to figure out what's contextually relevant. And then nodal, the centralized control, the command and control, and then developmental, the shift from standards or prescriptions to the health and growth of the entire system. So that would be the shifts, Hugh, that we're talking about to really allow for us to spend time in all different facets, from the individual to the larger communities, our countries, shifting those mindsets.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Trey. It's really always enjoy listening and going through those sort of shifts that we've got to think about and how we can use those. I know another area that you've been putting a lot of work into, and we've been working a bit on with you, is this, how we actually then put that into a design framework, how we start to think about how we can create those conditions that we talk about to ensure that we look after the health of the system that we're managing rather than falling back into silos. I wonder if it's probably a good time maybe just to introduce that and that thinking, and we can, at a future one, we'll deep dive into that a little bit more. Also, just like to remind people that if they have questions, and we've got one so far, yeah, put them on the Q&A and we'll take some time at the end to have a look at those as well.
Great. Yes, so just as we talked about before, if we have a principle-based design, it actually facilitates a framework design versus a prescriptive design. So we want to move from, well, this is what worked there, so it must work here. And what we find, and we can always go back to industrialized agriculture to show this, is that prescription has done nothing but really create a degenerative environment for the world that we're living. We've lost species, we've lost diversity, we've lost the soil health. And that's not because people wanted those things to happen. It's because we think that if we just treat it as a way to produce, that we'll actually be able to produce infinitum, right? And that's just not true. So what we need to do is create frameworks that allow us to regenerate the health of that system. So for us, it's that facilitated process that allows us to recognize that these frameworks have got and will require a completely different approach. So let me just move through these couple of slides real quick, because I think I've shown these before. So in this regenerative framework, what we recognize and is core to this design is, one, every system and every context is unique. So it should be designed around its uniqueness, which means it's the people that are involved or the environment, its uniqueness. There's some incredible work out there. Regenerative and a couple of other organizations have done this story of place, right? Where they're really trying to understand the uniqueness of an environment. And we see that in the uniqueness of an organization or the uniqueness of a person. It really scales the entire gamut, the uniqueness of a country, right? So if uniqueness is true, then prescriptions can't work. Let me just repeat that. If uniqueness is true, prescriptions can't work. Because what we want in any system is to bring out the energy in the system. And the energy in a system, in a social system in particular, is its people. In a natural system, it's its members, the species. So what do we do to create the conditions for those members to thrive? Well, that's a completely different process. One's extractive so that we can produce as much as we possibly can in the most efficient way possible. And the other is nurturing an environment that allows for the ability to regenerate that potential over and over and over again, because the energy is within the system. So what you'll notice as a part of this framework is it allows us to embrace the uniqueness and to ask the question, what is health? And that really is the difference. And that is a part of one of the major shifts in all this, is when we're addressing a living system, we have to ask, what is health? And when we begin to ask the question, what is health? It is our responsibility as a CEO, as a team member, as a prime minister, as a country, as a local district, to create the conditions for the members of those systems to thrive, which means it is a completely different process. And so you'll notice here, when we go through a design process using this framework, we may define the context, its deep why, its uniqueness, the boundary that exists for that system. But we then begin to identify what is health. Then we do a beautiful thing. We design structures to enable health first. And I don't know about you, I've been a part of leading and a part of organizations my entire career. The last thing I've done in the past is design for health in mind first. We've designed structures for work in mind, right? So just think about roles. Just think about job descriptions. Well, think about the work we've done in farming or agriculture. That those structures have existed to produce more, to get more out of the system. But what happens if structures are first and foremost designed to create the conditions of health? I mean, it changes the dynamics substantially. We're creating an environment, because the belief is that if we create an environment for people to thrive, where they can make intelligent decisions, that their uniqueness shows up, we have an exchange of that intelligence across the entire system, and it's a diverse supporting community. Those conditions, I will bet all day long, will be more abundant than any mechanistic machine paradigm could possibly ever be. So here we don't externalize things. We internalize it as a part of the system, as a means to create the conditions for abundance and resilience. So work then becomes an outcome of the health that we're doing. Yes, we're still going to do strategic planning, hopefully differently. We're going to still do and manage around priorities, but we're going to have products and programs and technologies and tools. And we're going to have some short-term outcomes, but we don't want them to be at the expense of the system, right? Enough's enough. We can't just pass the buck. We need to find a way to address it. And we all need to recognize it's our collective responsibility to do it. That is what creates the conditions for unlimited potential, or organizational resilience, or value and wealth creation across the entire system. I just had a beautiful conversation with some people who are re-envisioning investment. And what does it look like for us to invest, not necessarily in a single organization, but what about a watershed or an ecosystem? What if investment wasn't just based in that narrow, siloed, cut off organization or entrepreneur, but there was a system that saw investment and recognized it was going to have multiple roles, multiple members, all of which would benefit and all of which should be considered. That is a holistic, regenerative opportunity to produce unlimited potential idea. It's not just investing in a single siloed, off the cuff situation. And those are the things that we've got to shift.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Trey. I look forward to spending some more time and talking about that in the future and introducing the way that it's being used and some of the outcomes it's producing different places around the world. And we're trying to introduce it more into what we're doing here. One of the things that comes up often, though, and I think it's almost as badly understood as regenerative to some extent, is context. And people seem to, I think we don't spend enough time thinking about what our own context is and how that relates to what we want our lives or our organizations and things to look like. Have you got a comment you'd like to make on that, or just introduce the importance of that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that, and this really came from one of my mentors, Alan Savory at the Savory Institute, where he recognized the need to have a holistic context. And that holistic context was to recognize that in decision-making, the context cannot be the problem. It needs to be the ideal of what we want, that deeper purpose. And so he always would ask the question, should I start a fire? What's the answer to that question? It depends, right? I mean, fire can destroy or fire can warm you up. And so the idea of context is understanding that deep why and all those things that come together to give us a sense of how we would want to make decisions that would enable that purpose to come to life versus just a situational context or a problem being the context, all of which result in unintended consequences because the context can't be reduced down to a problem. It's bigger than that. It's multiple systems. It's multiple people. It's a quality of life. It's a greater purpose. So defining that, understanding that, deeply embracing that allows there to be a step into a living system that allows us to design accordingly. Without doing that, I think we're in a position to repeat what we've repeated for centuries. And so I think it's desirous of us, or at least for me, to consider an alternative to that.
That's great. Thanks, Trey. We probably just need to move on. We've got a couple of questions that have come off the floor, actually. They're from the same person. Thanks, Kathy. But I'll read them through. Policy and plan change in my area, and we're talking about the Waikato, is currently only looking at 4 contaminants from agriculture. This is part of Plan Change 1, nitrogen, phosphorus, E. coli, and sediment. How it impacts on rivers. They didn't include pesticides, the scope of regulatory change, because pesticides suppress or inhibit the natural biological uptake of nitrogen, which leads farmers to add fertilizer, other inputs. Question is, do you think pesticides are an important part of the system and the conversation that happens? And then that's been followed up with, if so, how do we get our policy and planning frameworks to transition from mechanistic design, silos, etc., to life principles and holistic design?
Hugh, you should take that first.
Yeah, I guess it's interesting, isn't it? One of the things that we seem to try and do in agriculture is we think we've got to kill everything to actually create production and life. And as Trey's already pointed out, everything. And I started off in the background. You might have noticed that was the food web, which is just an example of the interconnectedness that Trey talks about. And when we start to take parts of that out, we disrupt that whole system, and it just so we're just driving it back down into that same kind of design process that Trey's talking about. When you think about the industrialized or mechanistic approach to agriculture, we're driving ourselves back into that and not allowing nature to actually provide for us. We need to have the confidence that it can do that. So how we bring that around in terms of a policy and a planning change framework, well, I guess that's something we're working on. Is we're trying to get people to pick up with this regenerative framework that Trey's just outlined and start to bring that into the basis of policy making. Think more about the health of the system we're trying to create rather than just the outcomes that we're trying to produce.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that, Hugh, that last statement to me is key. If you go out there and start trying to lobby for pesticides to be included in this, you're going to lose because there's too much interest and vested interest in people selling those kinds of products in the system. But what if you ask, so what is health? How do we monitor and understand the health of the system? Because policymakers don't want to go against health. So what we want to do is open health up as a part of that conversation and then be redefining it. But you want the entry point to be health as a part of that conversation, because there may be instances of where things in the future, if it's some kind of chemical or some kind of design, that you may say in the appropriate situation, it may be useful, right? But what we want is not the health of the system to be compromised. So what can we do to recognize when policy is being formed, when people are being asked to be a part of that formation process, that it's allowed to bring all aspects of what health is? Because the other thing I would say is that's not included in that policy. You're just talking about an environmental policy. That's not at all addressing all the other things that show up in a community that is impacted. So what happens with food? What happens with water that we're drinking as a part of those underlying conditions that are being created in the community? How do we monitor that? So human health is deeply connected to all of this. So because it is interrelated, it doesn't at all limit where that connectedness is, which means our policy has to have that as a part of the design process.
So Trey, maybe just worth also, I mean, we're looking at how we can introduce this within a region as a pilot program for New Zealand, where we can look at how we can bring these sectors together that are actually all being impacted by these outcomes, whether they be health, whether they be social problems, whether they be agricultural issues. As Trey's pointed out, they're all connected. We can't put them into silos and deal with these. We've got to think of these as part of the wicked problems that are really confronting the world. So we're working on a project now to show how this and hopefully we can show that this is also a way that local government and local councils can work as part of delivering much better health as an outcome.
Yeah, just imagine a cross-sector approach that's holistic, that's truly regenerative in all aspects of its design, that is looking at the system as a whole and it's not just agriculture, it's not just food, it's education, it's healthcare, it's government, it's community members, and recognizing that all of those will have projects or work that needs to be done collectively, and they all should be at the table in those conversations. And as Hugh said, we've had multiple conversations with MPI and others within the country around how do we engage and put in place projects that have that kind of scope, because that's what's going to change things. And if that means we need to do it at a local level to show how that can work, then let's do it. Let's find ways to be able to do that.
Thanks, Trey. That's great. I think we probably need to just think about wrapping up there. And because the other thing I just want to introduce, I know you've got a project that you're looking at around what we call foundations of regenerative. And it's something that we want to roll out in New Zealand as well. And I think just worth putting a little bit of an explanation on what that's going to look like, how that could work, and what you see that looking like.
Great.
Maybe spending a couple of minutes on that.
Sure. So one of the things that we really encourage here is just an overview, giving you a sense of what regeneration is. So we're partnering with Hugh and Ada as a New Zealand organization to support organizations, farms, government, collaboratives, networks, in a way to continue to work on those shifts. And so we'll be doing a virtual course, on what the foundations of a regenerative organization look like. And that will have the opportunity for Q&A. So instead of doing it in a webinar style like this, it will have active, engaged people as a part of the design to allow you and others to deeply understand how we go into this as a part of a transition process in an organization. And then actually beyond that, we actually will have other what we call design labs, where we actually will say, bring what you want designed, and then we will design that together as a part of a future offering too within the country.
That's great. Thanks, Trey, and thanks for again taking the time and bringing your passion as always to these issues and help and just helping with our understanding. I guess from my relatively new involvement in some of these things that are going on and the way that we see them making a difference across everything that we're doing, and we've got people now using this regenerative framework in their own families and their own lives in different levels, and it's making a tremendous kind of difference. So as always, it's great to have you on board and great to have you involved. So appreciate that. And also, and to everyone who's come on board, thank you very much for taking the time out. As I said, we know it's a difficult time, and we're all sort of suffering this in different ways. And so hopefully you stay well, and there's something you can take out of this that's going to help you on your journey as well. We'll be having another in this series. So just look out for the notices in terms of when that timing's going to be. It might be a week or it might be 2 weeks out. So, but again, thank you very much for taking the time, and Trey, good to see you.
My pleasure, guys. Blessings on you all.